Today I ask you not just to listen, but to feel. To feel what it means when a mother cradles her lifeless child under the rubble of what used to be a home. To feel what it means when 28 children are killed every single day in Gaza and the world looks away. To feel the weight of silence, not just as absence, but as betrayal. This isn't just another conflict. This is a catastrophe unfolding in real time. And every moment of inaction writes another name on a grave too small for a dream that never got the chance to grow. We're going to talk about truth today. Truth that many are too afraid to say out loud. Why are European governments quiet? Why do scientists publish data on trauma but never name the hands that caused it? Why does the world count the dead but forget to count the cost of its own silence? If you care about justice anywhere, stay with me. If you believe a child's life should never be a political compromise, listen closely. And if your heart still has room for outrage, for compassion, for action, this is for you. Because by the end of this speech, you'll realize that silence is not an option, and neither is neutrality. Let's begin. The phrase, every day 28 children are killed in Gaza, is more than just a grim statistic. It is a symbol of ongoing human tragedy that reflects the collapse of ethical standards in modern warfare and the devastating costs borne by the most innocent. This figure, pulled from humanitarian reports and journalistic investigations during the Israel-Gaza conflict, underscores a relentless pattern of violence in which children, far removed from the politics and military strategies behind the war, are being slaughtered. The killing of children is not merely collateral damage. It is the product of a military campaign in one of the most densely populated civilian areas on Earth, where the lines between combatant and civilian are blurred by proximity, not by action. In Gaza, over half the population is under the age of 18. That makes any sustained aerial bombardment or ground invasion not just a military operation, but a guaranteed attack on children. Every strike on a building, every shell fired into a neighborhood carries with it the overwhelming likelihood of killing or injuring a child. Unlike conventional wars waged between opposing armies on defined battlefields, Gaza presents a scenario where children are surrounded by war with no escape. They are born into siege. They sleep under drones. They attend schools that double as shelters if they can attend school at all. The infrastructure, medical, educational, and residential, has been under blockade and repeated assault for nearly 2 decades, and the children grow up amid crumbled buildings and funeral processions. This figure, 28 children a day, does not account for the slow deaths that follow injury. It doesn't include those who die days later from untreated wounds, infections, or the collapse of Gaza's healthcare system. It does not capture the psychological deaths, the nightmares, the silence, the fear that becomes part of a child's character, the emotional toll on surviving children who have seen siblings dismembered, parents buried, homes turned to dust is immeasurable. The killing of 28 children a day in Gaza is a number that represents not just lives lost, but generations damaged, entire communities destabilized, and a future permanently disfigured. According to various humanitarian organizations, including Save the Children and UNICEF, the death toll of children in Gaza surpasses any recent armed conflict in terms of daily rate. For comparison, over the span of the Syrian civil war, which lasted for over a decade, the death rate of children never approached the current daily numbers reported in Gaza. Similarly, during the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the protracted war in Afghanistan, child casualties were high but did not follow the same concentrated, rapid pattern. What makes the Gaza numbers particularly horrifying is the concentrated timeline of the violence and the extremely limited avenues of escape. Gaza is blockaded by land, air, and sea. Its borders with Israel and Egypt are tightly controlled. The people inside, including the children, are effectively trapped in a war zone with no safe corridors, no real shelters, and no guarantees of humanitarian aid. International law, including the Geneva Conventions, explicitly protects children in conflict zones. The killing of children in such numbers should prompt a unified global outcry, immediate ceasefire negotiations, war crime investigations, and emergency humanitarian interventions. But in the case of Gaza, these children are often stripped of their names and replaced with numbers. Their deaths are summarized in daily bulletins, their pictures rarely shown, their stories often never told. The world hears 28 children and grows numb. The very repetition of these deaths, day after day, threatens to normalize them. When the global community allows such numbers to pass without serious intervention, it signals a terrifying moral failure. It reflects the erosion of universal human rights into geopolitical calculus. The political justifications offered for the mass killing of children in Gaza often invoke the presence of militant groups like Hamas operating within civilian areas. These explanations, repeated by Israeli officials and accepted without challenge by many Western governments, suggest that the presence of combatants in urban environments effectively voids the rights of civilians to live. However, this rationale directly contradicts international humanitarian law, which does not allow for proportionality to be thrown aside simply because the enemy operates from a civilian area. Even when an adversary hides among civilians, the attacking force retains the obligation to distinguish between military and civilian targets and to avoid disproportionate harm. The killing of children at the scale we are witnessing in Gaza cannot be squared with that obligation. There is a legal name for such outcomes. War crimes, and the targeting or reckless endangerment of children meets that threshold. Even beyond legality, there is the moral question. How can any society, particularly democratic nations that claim to uphold human rights and the sanctity of life, accept this scale of child death as a regrettable but necessary consequence? How can world leaders mourn the death of a single child in one country and excuse the mass murder of children in another because of their geography or ethnicity? This cognitive dissonance, this moral inconsistency has created an atmosphere in which the death of a Palestinian child does not command the same grief, outrage, or media coverage as the death of a Western or Israeli child. It dehumanizes Palestinian life and implicitly condones its erasure. The psychological impact on surviving children is another layer of this tragedy that amplifies its cruelty. Children who witness the killing of family members, experience the destruction of their homes, and suffer injuries from bombings often exhibit extreme trauma responses. Post-traumatic stress disorder is endemic. Children stop speaking, they develop chronic anxiety, they show signs of severe depression, nightmares, and emotional withdrawal. UNICEF psychologists have repeatedly stated that Gaza's children are not just suffering trauma, they are being broken by it. Yet the world rarely sees the drawings of these children. Their depictions of death from above, of funerals, of craters where their schools once stood. Their trauma is not televised. Their therapy, when available at all, is administered by overstretched professionals who themselves are traumatized. Furthermore, these deaths rob Palestinian society of its future. When children are killed in such numbers, the loss is not just personal, it is national. The next generation of teachers, doctors, poets, engineers, and leaders are being buried before they can write their first sentence. The children who survive may never regain their childhoods, and their chances for education, psychological healing, or meaningful development are shattered. With each child that dies, hope dies a little more. Occupation, blockade, and bombardment have turned Gaza into a graveyard of potential, and the world seems prepared to watch it happen again and again. Compounding this tragedy is the global reaction, or lack thereof. In conflicts around the world, mass child casualties typically trigger immediate diplomatic pressure, emergency aid, and media saturation. But in the case of Gaza, the response is subdued, often deflected with appeals to Israel's right to self-defense or statements urging restraint from both sides. The deaths of children become entangled in geopolitical alliances, military aid agreements, and long-standing ideological narratives. The result is paralysis. While governments debate language and diplomacy, the airstrikes continue and children continue to die. The figure of 28 children a day should be a scream that wakes the conscience of the international community. Instead, it has become a muted whisper, too easily forgotten by those in power. This is not about whether one supports Israel or Palestine or whether one believes in one state or two. It is about whether there is any threshold of human suffering that demands universal outrage. The deaths of children should never be minimized by what side of a border they were born on. If international norms mean anything, if the United Nations Charter and the Geneva Conventions have any more weight than the killing of children, any children, anywhere, must be a red line. Yet in Gaza, that line is crossed daily, and the world merely updates the numbers. The phrase 28 children a day is more than a tragedy. It is a measure of our failure as a global community. It is a reflection of the hierarchy of human life that persists in global politics. It is a brutal reminder that the lives of some children are considered disposable, while others are defended with armies and outrage. Until this moral disparity is confronted, and until action replaces apathy, the cycle of death will continue. The world will keep counting the bodies, but counting is not enough. European governments. Silence refers to the deafening lack of political condemnation, decisive action, or even consistent moral clarity from European Union, EU member states in response to the mass killing of civilians in Gaza, particularly children. This silence is not accidental. It is deeply rooted in the geopolitical alliances, historical guilt, security priorities, and political cowardice that define Europe's relationship with the Israel-Palestine conflict. At a time when thousands of civilians are being killed in full view of the global community, Europe's unwillingness to speak out with urgency and moral force reveals a profound failure of conscience and leadership. European leaders are not uninformed. They have access to the same reports issued by the United Nations, the same footage of bombed out schools and hospitals, and the same statistics that show the horrifying toll on children. Yet their official responses are usually framed in neutral language that places equal moral weight on both the aggressor and the victim. Phrases like, "We urge both sides to de-escalate," or "all lives are valuable," become rhetorical tools to avoid taking a stance. But in a situation where one side is overwhelmingly more powerful, more militarized, and more capable of inflicting large-scale destruction, neutrality is not balance, it is complicity. By refusing to clearly condemn disproportionate violence or demand accountability, European governments tacitly endorse the ongoing carnage. The silence is especially glaring when compared to how European nations have responded to other international crises. In the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the EU rapidly imposed sweeping sanctions, froze assets, provided humanitarian aid, and publicly condemned Russian leadership at every level. Political leaders across Europe wore blue and yellow pins, lit up national monuments in the Ukrainian flag, and offered immediate asylum to millions of Ukrainian refugees. The justification for this solidarity was framed in moral terms: the defense of democracy, the protection of civilians, and opposition to imperialism. In contrast, Palestinian civilians facing a siege, displacement, and aerial bombardments do not receive the same moral standing. European silence in the face of Palestinian suffering lays bare a disturbing double standard in the application of human rights. One of the key reasons for this inconsistency lies in the deep historical entanglement between Europe and the modern state of Israel. European guilt over the Holocaust, which led to the extermination of 6 million Jews, created a post-war political environment in which criticism of Israel became extremely sensitive. This guilt has often translated into uncritical political support or muted opposition to Israeli military actions, even when they violate international law. To question Israeli policy has, in some circles, been wrongly equated with anti-Semitism, stifling open and necessary political discourse. This conflation creates a chilling effect where European politicians, fearful of backlash, prefer silence over justice. Moreover, Israel is considered by many European governments to be a strategic partner in the Middle East, both in terms of intelligence sharing and military technology. Countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom maintain defense contracts and cybersecurity cooperation with Israel. These ties often weigh more heavily than humanitarian concerns, and foreign policy becomes a calculus of national interest rather than a platform for the defense of universal human rights. Silence in in this context is not just moral failure, it is political choice, prioritizing arms deals and intelligence access over the lives of Palestinian children. Some European governments attempt to balance their response by issuing humanitarian aid to Gaza while avoiding direct criticism of the bombings. While aid is vital, it does not excuse political silence. In fact, it becomes a paradox, offering bandages while watching the wounds being inflicted, providing tents, food, and trauma care to a population being actively bombed by a military power one refuses to censure amounts to institutional hypocrisy. It allows governments to appear compassionate while avoiding accountability for their role in enabling the violence. Through arms sales, diplomatic cover, and silence at international forums. In addition, the EU as a collective body has struggled to speak with one voice on the Israel-Palestine conflict. While some member states, such as Ireland and Spain, have taken a more vocal stance in condemning the violence and calling for ceasefires, others have continued to support Israeli military actions or abstain from critical votes at the United Nations. This fragmentation reveals the internal divisions within Europe and the difficulty of building a unified foreign policy when national interests and historical perspectives vary so widely. As a result, the EU's position is often watered down to the lowest common denominator, non-committal statements of concern that carry little moral or political weight. Civil society across Europe, however, tells a different story. While governments remain muted, European streets have seen some of the largest pro-Palestinian demonstrations in recent history. In cities like London, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, and Brussels, tens of thousands of citizens have marched in solidarity with Gaza, demanding an immediate ceasefire and condemning their government's inaction. These protests reflect a growing disconnect between official policy and public sentiment for European citizens. Particularly younger generations are increasingly critical of the double standards in foreign policy and are using social media, public demonstrations, and grassroots organizing to amplify Palestinian voices. Yet, despite this public pressure, the political class remains largely unmoved, beholden to outdated paradigms and alliances. Another dimension of Europe's silence is its impact on international institutions. When European nations fail to condemn clear violations of human rights and international law, it undermines the credibility of global bodies such as the United Nations Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, and the Geneva Conventions themselves. Europe, which historically positioned itself as a defender of the rules-based international order, weakens that very order when it applies those rules selectively. The erosion of these norms doesn't just affect Palestinians, it sets a precedent that other governments can exploit, emboldening authoritarian regimes and undermining global human rights protections. Europe's silence also reverberates through its immigrant communities, many of whom are of Arab or Muslim descent. These communities see the disparity in response to Palestinian suffering as a reflection of institutional racism and exclusion. They ask why Ukrainian refugees were welcomed with open arms while Palestinian or Syrian refugees are met with suspicion, delay, and hostility. The silence on Gaza deepens the sense of alienation, signaling that their lives, their families, their grief are somehow less worthy of recognition. This not only threatens social cohesion, but also raises serious questions about the universality of European values. Furthermore, the language of European leaders often betrays a profound asymmetry in empathy. When Israeli civilians are harmed, European leaders respond swiftly with personal condolences, strong condemnations, and visible gestures of solidarity. But when dozens or hundreds of Palestinian children are killed in a single day, the response is often muted, abstract, or absent. This imbalance in grief is a political statement. It communicates which lives are seen, valued, and protected. The cost of this disparity is not just moral. It contributes to the dehumanization of Palestinians and desensitization of European publics. Media plays a critical role in shaping this silence. In many European outlets, coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict is framed through a narrow lens that prioritizes Israeli security concerns and uses language that obscures power dynamics. Terms like clashes, crossfire, or escalation sanitize what is often one-sided violence. Images of Palestinian suffering are often delayed, filtered, or downplayed, reinforcing narratives that allow political leaders to remain passive. While some independent and alternative media sources provide more balanced reporting, mainstream platforms often echo the political